You would think that in 2023, revisionism and denialism of Axis atrocities would be a thing of the past, but political agendas have continued to make this kind of rhetoric popular. On top of this, the histories taught in schools color public debate and discussion. So, how have German and Japanese politicians discussed their country's war crimes, and how do those opinions affect the online perception of war crimes? From 1933 to 1945, Nazi Germany targeted Jewish populations and other minorities across Europe in a genocide that would later be known as the Holocaust. Since the 1970s, Germany has taken steps to memorialize and reconcile with the 6 million victims and their descendants. Still, controversies exist within their education system relating to the amount of responsibilities modern Germans should take for the crimes of the Nazi Party. Some Germans believe the Holocaust should be viewed in a similar way as the war crimes of other nations. Others are firm in the need to continue educating youth about past atrocities, arguing that it is part of their collective identity. Germany's overall apologetic attitude towards their crimes stands in stark contrast to the narrative Japan has constructed since 1945. The Empire of Japan's colonial expansion featured a series of aggressive military campaigns which were marked by atrocities against civilians and soldiers. Some of those atrocities included the use of comfort women, a group of around 200,000 girls and women forced into sexual slavery from 1932 to 1945. Another major atrocity was the Nanjing Massacre, perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1937. Both are still heavily contested in academic and public discourse today. Still, the post-war Japanese government actively developed narratives that marginalized the experience of victims. Mainstream historical narratives and political rhetoric impact how the German and Japanese public perceive the atrocities of the Second World War. Germany takes a more reconciliatory approach to their remembrance of the Holocaust, while Japanese political narratives often deny and diminish the severity of their crimes. This is then reflected in digital public histories, which can repeat or contradict the established historical authorities. This video will demonstrate that Germany's conciliatory policies result in a more productive public dialogue, whereas Japan's revisionism has made it increasingly acceptable for the public to cast doubt on the veracity of imperial war crimes. In the early days of denazification, things such as changing laws and street names and removing Nazi symbols and books were easy. However, the question of how to deal with the approximate 8.5 million Nazi Party members as well as the millions of German civilians who believed in Nazi rhetoric was much more difficult. Until the 1950s, the Allies used internment camps to detain approximately 400,000 Germans. They also sought to remove civil servants from their positions. Though numerous trials were held, according to the Wiener Holocaust Library, the denazification process was never fully completed. The goal became increasingly difficult when the Cold War began, as the Nazis who still held power within West Germany were deemed less of a threat than the Communist Soviets. Therefore, former Nazis got to keep their positions in government. Furthermore, in 1949, some Germans such as Konrad Adenauer, the FRG's first chancellor, felt that integrating old Nazis into the new republic was the best way to move forward. In East Germany, the Soviets also detained political opponents along with Nazis in their special camps called Spezlager. The Soviets built their own camps and used the former concentration camps to house their prisoners. According to author Ulrich Merton, tens of thousands of Germans died there. When it came to denazifications, the Allies laid particular importance on re-educating the German youth to ensure nothing like the Holocaust would ever happen again. According to Josh Niemtzau, the Americans oversaw the publication of German textbooks that employed more interactive forms of learning. These books offered discussion questions and provided suggestions for assignments which teachers could utilize. One of the best history textbooks was the Wege des Völker series, which were first published with the assistance of American officials who vetted the textbook's writers for Nazi leanings. The texts emphasized critical thinking over accumulating facts and utilized group assignments and classroom debate topics. However, one of the biggest problems the Allies faced when it came to the re-education of German youth was the fact that prior to World War II, Hitler ensured that they were being educated by Nazi-supporting teachers. However, when the Allies removed these teachers from their positions, they did not have enough replacements and so had to resort to reinstating some former Nazis. The first 2 decades following the war, textbooks in West Germany did not spare their teenage readers the horrors of the war. Texts published in the first 2 post-war decades dedicated analysis to the air war, starvation, and the expellees from the East. According to Brian M. Puaka, young Germans learned about the high price Germany paid as a result of, quote, Hitler's war, lost lives, homes, territory, and possessions. Some textbooks during this time would essentially equate the Germans' suffering to that of the Jews. Hanging the responsibility for the war on Hitler and a small group of his supporters was a common ploy in this period. This ploy, as Puaka puts it, allowed the post-war Germans to feel separate from the Nazis. Following this logic, they would not be guilty of the crimes committed during World War II, and their own suffering could come into the forefront of the historical narrative. Further evidence of this ploy can be seen in post-war literature and films up until the late 1980s. Many of these chose to focus on the German victims of the Soviets or those who were forced to fight for the Nazis rather than the Nazis themselves. Omer Bartov skillfully explains this by saying, what is absent from such German representations of the past is the tragedy of others. Works such as Heinrich Böll's novel The Train Was on Time and Alexander Kluge's film The Patriot both tell the stories of Germans as the victims. The absence of depictions of the Jewish experience in both works leaves the audience empathizing with a German soldier in one case and a school teacher who wishes to remake history in the other. They are framed to be the tragic victims caught in the clutches of forces they cannot control. These depictions in German media only really changed after the release of the American miniseries The Holocaust in 1978, which depicts a Jewish family struggling to survive. This series highlights the atrocities committed by the Nazis and forces the German public to come to terms with that part of their history. Today, Germany discusses the Holocaust with open acknowledgement of their role as perpetrators. The memorialization and reconciliation efforts are an official policy, thus the public has to confront the realities of the Holocaust. Still, there are differing perspectives and sentiments about these policies. The German education system is oriented towards acknowledging the Holocaust tragedies. Secondary school extensively covers World War II, including field trips to concentration camps and in-depth acknowledgments of the war crimes committed. Josh Nimzow examines the German school system, which is split between 3 academic streams. He writes, thus, when one examines German Holocaust education, one must consider that some students will learn about the Holocaust in different ways, at different times in their schooling, and perhaps in more depth. Different reactions to these policies range from agreement to resentment to disinterest. Opposition to the reconciliatory policies has also led to the rise of neo-Nazism. This dissatisfaction has stemmed from what some citizens feel is the mandatory acknowledgement of the Holocaust. Among online discussions, the impression some people hold today is that other nations have had their fair share of atrocities, yet they still get to be patriotic, whereas Germany is prevented from expressing their national pride, since reconciliation has become a core aspect of their identity. According to an online NBC article titled, Germans Still Grapple with World War II Legacy, some citizens feel that their German identity is overshadowed by the atrocities of the Holocaust. It stressed that in the Federal Republic of Germany, dealing with the Nazi past has become an element of cultural identity, and pride for German representation has become discouraged socially. National anthems, flags, and other forms of pride are generally discouraged in the modern day. A museum in Germany known as the Documentation Center for Displacement, Expulsion, and Reconciliation opened in 2021, discussing the hardships that individuals experienced after the war. According to Daniel Bellamy, escaping the Russian army and later pushed out by occupying powers and local authorities, approximately 14 million Germans were expelled or forced to flee from countries in Eastern Europe between 1944 and 1950. An estimated 600,000 Germans lost their lives on the trek. This included people who had settled in Nazi-occupied territories, as well as ethnic Germans who had lived for centuries as minorities in other countries. This history is often underrepresented, and the museum's existence has caused contention and controversy among the public. This is because some still hold shame for the actions committed by their country in the Holocaust, while others fervently support the museum's existence. The reconciliation in Germany has influenced digital media that either comes from Germany or is about them. In digital media, desensitization surrounding Holocaust jokes and Hitler memes are being heavily associated with German identity.
The brave boy who refused to give a Nazi salute in the photo that's shocking America is speaking out.
As soon as I heard the photographer say, "Raise your hand," I knew what was going to happen. He said, "Raise your hand."
This dark humor is also expressed not only by Germans themselves, but projected onto them by other nations. Now let's turn to Germany's Axis ally, Imperial Japan. 9,000 kilometers away, major atrocities were being committed by the Japanese military. Many of these girls and women and their families were impoverished. They were entrapped by collaborators claiming they wanted female volunteers to work in factories abroad to help with the Japanese war effort. When it became evident that this wasn't the job that they were going to be doing, The collaborators would then promise that some of the money they would make could be sent back home to their families. This trick turned the recruitment process into a kidnapping operation. Typically, these girls were 13 to 16 years old, but some were as young as 11 and others were as old as 22. In 1991, the first survivor to come forward and speak was Kim Hak-sun. She said, "They dragged me by the arms, but how could I not resist? I was scared. They were kicking me, saying if I obeyed, I would be happy. Otherwise, I would be dead." The young girl dared to resist and was raped by him. The last part of her testimony was a form of dissociation. She was in fact explaining her experiences of being taken by the Japanese military as a young woman. After 46 years of these women living in the shadows, they finally found an environment that gave them back their power and brought them out from the subaltern. Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak defines the subaltern as a group or individual who has a structural lack of access to power. The survivors were forced into subalternity for two main reasons. The first was the strict patriarchal society they lived in, and the second was the language the Japanese forced the girls and women to use. According to Soyoung Park, an assistant professor with a focus on military sexual slavery, women issues in Asia, the strict patriarchal society endorsed women's roles that epitomized silent devotion towards their family and men, and celebrates the absence of women's claims for reward for this devotion. Kim Yoon-sim, another survivor, broke her silence and discussed the shame that she was made to experience by the rejection and abandonment of her family for losing her virginity before marriage. She experienced the same rejection from her first husband and his family for her perceived disability of barrenness. As she continued to speak up, she said, "Those who should be ashamed are not us, but you," referencing the Japanese government. The language that the girls and women were forced to use during their time as sexual slaves was a form of ideological manipulation. Japan forced the girls to use phrases like, quote, "receiving customers in the, quote, comfort houses," to make them feel and see themselves as prostitutes. Interviewers still noticed the survivors using this sort of language and talking about clients when referencing the Japanese soldiers they were forced to serve. Another widely disputed atrocity was committed in Nanjing. According to Takashi Yoshida, in the weeks following the December 1937 occupation, the Imperial Japanese Army murdered more than 200,000 people. However, politicians often minimize the severity of the war crimes or outright deny them. Political narratives often contradict more progressive academics. An example of this can be found on the website of Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they refer to the massacre as the Nanjing Incident. This language is an attempt to dispute the realities of the massacre, and despite some public apologies, government officials have not stopped casting doubt on the legitimacy of the evidence. Keep in mind that these following quotes are translated from Japanese. In a 2006 letter now published on the House of Representatives website, Takashi Kawamura uses denialist academics to cast doubt on the reconciliatory histories established by progressives. He quotes Shudo Higashi Nakano, who complains that there was no photographic evidence of the Nanjing massacre, but the Chinese government has displayed those photographs in the Nanjing Incident Memorial. This essentially discredits the large collection of primary source photographs collected by the various witnesses of the Nanjing massacre. Effectively, Kawamura trusts the testimonies of Japanese perpetrators over the photographic evidence of the Chinese victims. Even though government officials contradict academics, journalists such as Riki Yoshi have popularized the arguments of progressives. In an online article published in the national Japanese newspaper Mainichi Shimbun, Yoshi relates the words of Professor Tokushi Kasahara. The characteristic of those who speak in denial is that they ignore the primary sources that recorded the massacre. Yoshi is using progressive academics like Kasahara to discredit Naoki Hyakuta's denialist book. He says that this book is actually selling well. This demonstrates a level of public support that is not necessarily openly expressed. It also shows that there is still contention within public discourse as to which historical narrative is more accurate. Public education administered by a central government has been a pillar of the modern Japanese nation-state. In the Imperial era, schools and textbooks approved by the Ministry of Education portrayed the empire's wars as a heroic undertaking in order to make a positive impression on young minds. These biased sentiments would endure throughout the war until the Allied occupation. It was hoped that by ending ministerial oversight of textbooks, commercial publishers would be able to showcase the varied perspectives of the war. However, this did not last, as the central government reasserted control and began to regulate the contents of the textbooks after Japan regained its sovereignty. Professor Peter Cave states that it was not until the mid-1960s that junior high history textbooks mentioned Japanese colonial and wartime oppression in Asia, and not until the 1970s that treatment of these topics began to be at all extensive. This has, however, been contested by other scholars. Professor Saburo Inenga argues that by the late 20th century, history textbooks adopted a more comprehensive view of World War II, as they agreed Japan pursued a war of aggression as a fascist state, allied with Germany and Italy. They also included the Nanjing Massacre, as well as Japan's use of poison gas and slave labor. These changes to the textbook elicited a response from nationalist organizations such as the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform. They would criticize the material by saying that Japan's history textbooks had become masochistic as a result of what it saw as excessive focus on the darker aspects of Japanese history. Their critiques and the increasing authority of local school boards in the early 2000s led to publishers reducing content covering war crimes. These reductions in the first decade of the 21st century destabilized fragile relations between Japan and its neighbors in Northeast Asia. Another contributor to public history was the memorialization of World War II history in Japan and Korea. Japan's World War II museums can be split into two different types: aggression and peace museums. Peace museums, according to Professor Roger B. Jeans, covers both the Japanese as victimizers as well as victims, whereas aggression museums glorify the actions of the army and the navy and downplay the war crimes they committed. In Japan, a prominent place of memory is the Yasukuni Shrine complex, which contains both the shrine itself and the Yushukan Museum. The exhibits in the Yushukan Museum contest the record of Japan's atrocities and spread harmful myths about Japanese aggression. The exhibits reduce the victims of Japanese war crimes to the subaltern, as the museum makes no reference to comfort women, nor are there any mentions of massacres or other war crimes. This museum represents a typical aggression museum. Next to it is the Yasukuni Shinto Shrine itself. Constructed in 1869 by the Meiji Emperor, the shrine honors the spirits of those who died for the Japanese Empire. However, after World War II, the Yasukuni controversially enshrined war criminals, but this fact would not come to the forefront of public discourse until 1985, when Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone paid his respects at the shrine using public funds for offerings and signing the guest register with his official title. Another example of denialism is when Japan's former Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, honored the Imperial Japanese soldiers at the Yasukuni Shrine in 2013 and 2020. This caused outrage among Chinese and Koreans because they viewed the memorialized veterans as war criminals. Through their actions, both Nakasone and Abe have essentially reduced the victims of Japanese soldiers to subalternity. The shrine is not the only memorial that has been seen as contentious. On Wednesday, December 14, 2011, in Seoul, outside of the Japanese embassy, what would be the first of a series of statues of peace dedicated to comfort women was installed. The statue has two chairs. One is meant to represent a comfort woman, and the other is empty for the woman who died. As seen through blog posts and articles on the conversation, the location of this statue sparked contention and strained the relationship between South Korea and Japan. Japan felt that the statue's location outside embassies violated the 1961 and 1963 Vienna Convention around diplomatic relations and consular relations. Japan argues that South Korea has failed to prevent any disturbance of the peace of the diplomatic mission/consular post or impairment of its dignity. It is important to note that this statue being unveiled on a Wednesday was a political statement because beginning on January 14, 1992, victims and their supporters convened to demand redress, which would continue every Wednesday afternoon outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. These protests continued, and in 2019 they celebrated the 1400th gathering, bringing thousands of protesters to the site over the years. Their resilience has garnered them and their cause a lot of media attention. This effectively brought the survivors out of subalternity. Japan tried to demand the removal of the statue, but was ultimately unsuccessful as the statue remains and other statues like it began to appear all over the world. In Japan, peace museums were initially established in the immediate aftermath of the war. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum focused on the suffering of Japanese imperial citizens. There was initial opposition to the museums for including exhibits that gave context to what led to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1992, a new private museum, the Kyoto Museum for World Peace, was founded at Ritsumeikan University. From the start, it introduced the notion that Japan was responsible for its entry into the 15-year war and the war crimes committed throughout the war. The difference between these two types of institutions demonstrates the variety of positions held in the debate surrounding Japanese war crimes. To recap, in Germany, the Allied forces attempted to denazify the country by removing laws, symbols, and Nazis in positions of power. However, the most important step was the re-education of the youth. The denazification process was never fully completed, and differences existed between the occupied East and West. It was not until the 1980s that the Germans were forced to face the record of war crimes committed by their country during the war. In Germany today, there are hundreds of monuments, memorials, and exhibits to commemorate and educate the general public and tourists on the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II. Nevertheless, Germans have been discouraged from expressing national pride, causing some of them to be very dissatisfied. In Japan, it has been the opposite. Survivors and their descendants are the ones demanding recognition, apologies, and more education to avoid any chances of the offenses being repeated. These requests or demands are what motivate Japanese progressives. Still, denialism and revisionism exists on an institutional level, as evidenced by the so-called aggression museums. Political and academic denialism has also plagued Japan's public discourse, weakening the progressive narrative. There is hope, however, as new peace museums and international pressures have forced the Japanese public to re-examine their harmful narratives.